My mother-in-law forged my husband's signature on a $40,000 loan behind our backs. I only found out because a bank teller recognized my last name and congratulated me on a refinance we never applied for. She put my husband's credit on the line to secretly bail out his sister and pay off hidden debts. Her excuse when we confronted her, she said it's not forgery if it's family. But things got way worse when we found out she was already planning to secretly sell the family cabin. My mother-in-law forged my husband's signature on a $40,000 loan, and I only found out because a bank teller recognized my last name. I'm Jenna, I'm 33, and I've been married to Mark for 6 years. We don't have a fancy life. He's an electrician, I do billing for a dental office, and most weekends we're either mowing the lawn or driving up to his family's lake cabin in Wisconsin. That cabin is the one thing in his family that actually means something to me. His grandfather built it in the 60s with his own hands, plank by plank, and when he passed, it went to Mark's parents, Carol and Denny, with the understanding that eventually it would go to Mark and his sister Brooke to share. I say understanding, because nothing was ever written down. That's important later. So back in March, I was at the bank depositing a check from my grandmother, and the teller, an older woman named Pam, who's helped us with our mortgage stuff before, said, "Oh, tell your husband congratulations on the refinance. That closed up nice and quick." I just kind of blinked at her. Refinance on what? She looked at her screen, then looked at me, and her face changed a little. The property on Birchwood Lane. I probably shouldn't have said anything. I'm sorry. I just assumed you knew. Birchwood Lane is the cabin. I told her that's fine. No big deal. And I left with my heart going about 100 miles an hour. Mark hadn't said one word to me about refinancing anything. And we don't own the cabin. His parents do. So either the bank had the wrong name, or something was happening that I had absolutely no idea about. I called Mark on my drive home. I tried to keep my voice normal. "Hey, weird question. Did you refinance the cabin or something?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough that I noticed it. "What? No. Why would I do that? It's not even ours. The bank said your name was on something. A refinance that closed." Another pause. "That doesn't make sense. I haven't signed anything. Maybe they mixed me up with my dad." I let it go for the rest of that day because I didn't want to start a fight over something that might just be a clerical error. But it sat in my stomach the whole night, like a rock. 2 days later, I drove to the bank on my lunch break and asked Pam, very casually, if there was any way I could get a copy of that refinance paperwork, since my husband's name was apparently on it. She said she couldn't just print it for me without him there. But she mentioned, off the record, that the loan was a home equity line against the cabin, $40,000, and both Mark and his sister Brooke were listed as co-signers alongside Carol and Denny. Co-signers, which meant if this loan went bad, Mark and Brooke's credit was on the hook for it. That night I sat Mark down and told him everything Pam had said. I watched his face go through about 4 different emotions in 10 seconds. Confusion, then something like fear, then anger. "I never signed anything," he said. "I swear to you, Jenna, I have not signed a single piece of paper for that house since Grandpa died." "Then how is your name on a loan?" He didn't answer right away. He just got his phone and called his mom. I could only hear his side of the conversation, but it went from calm to loud pretty fast. Things like, "Mom, what did you do?" And "That's not legal, you can't just." And then a long silence where he was clearly listening. When he hung up, he looked kind of gray. "She says Dad's back surgery cost more than insurance covered. She said she needed the loan to cover it, and the bank required both signers on the deed to be on the paperwork. So she just signed for me. And for Brooke. She forged your signature. She says it's not forgery if it's family." I actually laughed out loud at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was such an insane thing to say. Forgery is forgery whether it's your mom or a stranger off the street. I didn't say that to Mark right then because he looked like he was about to be sick. But I was thinking it very loudly. Here's where I need to back up a little and explain the family dynamic. Because none of this happens in a vacuum. Carol, my mother-in-law, has always run that family like she's the CEO and everyone else is staff. She's not a mean person exactly. She's just used to nobody pushing back. Denny, Mark's dad, mostly goes along with whatever Carol decides because it's easier than arguing. And Brooke, Mark's younger sister, has had a rough few years. She got divorced 18 months ago from a guy named Chris, who turned out to have a gambling problem nobody in the family talks about directly. They just call it Chris's issues. Brooke's been living back with Carol and Denny since the divorce, along with her 2 kids, and everyone kind of tiptoes around bringing up money in front of her because she's proud and it embarrasses her. So when Mark told me it was about Denny's back surgery, I believed it, because Denny really did have back surgery in January, and I remember Carol complaining about insurance at Thanksgiving. What I didn't know yet was that the surgery story was only half true. A week after the phone call, Mark drove to his parents' house to get copies of the actual loan documents, because at that point he wanted to see his own forged signature with his own eyes. Carol tried to talk him out of coming, said she'd mail them, but he told her no. He was coming that day. I went with him. I probably shouldn't have, in hindsight, because it made everything more tense, but I wasn't about to sit at home while my husband's credit history got dragged through something he didn't agree to. Carol answered the door, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Denny was in his recliner in the living room and barely looked up from the TV, which told me he already knew what was coming and didn't want any part of it. Carol handed Mark a manila folder without much of a greeting. He sat at the kitchen table and started going through it while I stood behind him, and Carol hovered by the counter with her arms crossed like she was the one who'd been wronged. The signature on the page did not look anything like Mark's. It was close, but the letters were rounder, and anyone who has seen Mark sign a receipt 100 times would clock it in 2 seconds. Brooke's signature was on there too, also clearly not hers. "Does Brooke know about this?" I asked. Carol's mouth went tight. "Brooke has enough on her plate." "So she doesn't know you signed her name either." I was going to tell her once things settled down. Mark looked up from the papers. "Mom, this is $40,000. Against a house I don't legally own, but I'm now responsible for if you default. How were you planning on settling this down without telling either of us?" And this is where twist number 1 landed, because Carol's answer was not what either of us expected. "Because I was going to pay it back before you ever needed to know, from the sale." "What sale?" Carol went quiet for a second too long, and then it came out. She and Denny had already talked to a realtor about listing the cabin. Not this summer, not next summer, but eventually, once Brooke was back on her feet. Because Carol had decided that the cabin was really the only asset the family had that could give Brooke a real financial cushion. The loan wasn't just for Denny's surgery. Part of it, the part Carol hadn't mentioned to Mark on the phone, had already gone to Brooke, to pay off collection accounts left over from the divorce and to put a deposit on an apartment so she and the kids could eventually move out on their own. So the surgery was real. But it was maybe $15,000 of the 40. The rest had quietly gone to bail out Brooke, using a cabin that was supposed to eventually be split between Mark and Brooke as collateral, without either of them knowing, and with both of their names forged onto the paperwork. I want to say I stayed calm through this whole conversation, but I didn't. I said something like, "You forged 2 adults' signatures to secretly fund your daughter without telling your son, using an asset that's supposed to be half his?" And Carol snapped back that I didn't get a say in family matters because I married in. That one stung more than I expected. Mark actually stood up for me, told his mom that was out of line, and for a second I thought we were all about to have a real screaming match in that kitchen. But Denny, of all people, got up from his recliner and came in and said, "Carol, enough. Show him the rest." The rest turned out to be twist number 2. There was a second loan back in 2019 when Mark and Brooke's grandmother, Carol's own mother, was still alive and in a nursing home, Carol had taken out a smaller loan against the cabin to help cover a gap in care costs, and had never told either of her kids that one existed either. That one had actually been paid off over the years, quietly, out of Carol and Denny's regular income, so it hadn't caused a crisis, but it meant this wasn't a one-time slip. This was a pattern. Carol had apparently decided a long time ago that the cabin was hers to leverage whenever she needed to, regardless of whose name was theoretically attached to the future of it. Mark asked her, pretty flatly, "Does the current loan even have my real signature verified anywhere? Or did you literally just write my name? I signed for you because it was faster. You were at work. I know your signature. That's identity fraud, Mom. Don't be dramatic." I remember looking at Denny during this, because he'd gone very quiet again, sitting back down in his recliner, and I realized he'd known about both loans the whole time and just let Carol handle it, because that's their marriage. He wasn't a bad guy. He was just a man who'd learned decades ago that arguing with Carol wasn't worth it, and I actually felt a little sorry for him in that moment, caught between his wife and his kids. We left that day without resolving anything. Mark was quiet the whole ride home, and when we got in the door, he just sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands and said, "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do with this." I told him he had options. He could report it. He could demand the loan get refinanced properly with real signatures, or paid off entirely. He could talk to a lawyer. But I also told him this was his family and his call, and I wasn't going to push him toward burning bridges he might regret burning. I just wanted him to actually decide something instead of freezing, because right then he was doing what Denny does, which is nothing. That's when he told me the thing that changed how I saw this whole situation, which is twist number 3. He said, "The cabin's not even really split between me and Brooke on paper. It's still 100% in Mom and Dad's names. There's no will that says it comes to us. Mom's told us for years it would, but there's nothing legal backing that up. If she wants to sell it outright tomorrow, she can, and neither of us could stop her." I hadn't realized that. I'd always just assumed, the way you assume things about in-laws' property, that there was some kind of paper trail, some kind of trust or agreement. There wasn't. It was all verbal, which meant the forged signatures weren't really the only problem. The bigger problem was that Mark had spent years thinking of that cabin as half his, taking weekends off work to help re-shingle the roof, paying for a new dock out of his own pocket 2 summers ago, and none of it was legally guaranteed to ever be his at all. I asked him straight out, "Do you want to try to get something in writing, or do you want to let this go completely and just treat it like it was never going to be yours?" He said he needed to think about it. And for once, I actually let him have the space to think instead of pushing. About a week later, Brooke found out. Not from Carol, and not from Mark either, actually. She found out because she went to apply for an apartment on her own, finally ready to move out with the kids, and the landlord ran a credit check that flagged the new home equity loan under her name that she had never authorized and never signed. She showed up at Mark and my house on a Tuesday night, furious, holding a printout of her credit report. "Did you know about this?" she asked Mark. "I found out a couple weeks ago." "And you didn't tell me?" "I was trying to figure out what to do." Brooke started crying, which surprised both of us, because Brooke's usually the tough one in that family, the one who doesn't show much. She said she'd been so relieved when Carol told her the deposit for her new apartment was a gift, and finding out it was actually fraud, that her name had been forged onto a document without her knowledge, on top of everything else she'd been through with the divorce, felt like the ground had opened up again, right when she thought she was finally getting stable. This was twist number 4 for me, because up until that point, I had privately been a little frustrated with Brooke, assuming she was just letting her mom bail her out without asking questions. Finding out she genuinely had no idea, that Carol had deliberately kept her in the dark the same way she'd kept Mark in the dark, made me realize Carol wasn't just overstepping with one kid. She was managing both of her adult children like they were still teenagers, who couldn't be trusted with the truth about their own lives. The 3 of us, me, Mark, and Brooke, sat at our kitchen table until almost midnight that night, going through the actual paperwork together. Brooke, it turned out, had a friend from her divorce who worked as a paralegal, and she called her the next morning. The paralegal told her, plainly, that forging a signature on a loan document is fraud, regardless of family relationship, that Brooke and Mark could report it to the bank's fraud department, and that the bank would likely be very motivated to fix it quietly, rather than risk it becoming a legal mess, since technically the bank itself had an obligation to verify identity and hadn't done so properly. Mark and Brooke went to the bank together that Friday. I didn't go this time. I felt like it needed to be the two of them as siblings, without me standing there representing the in-law side of things. They sat down with a bank manager, not Pam, someone above her, and explained the situation. The bank pulled the notarization records, because home equity loans are supposed to be notarized. And it turned out Carol had actually gotten a notary stamp on the documents from a woman at a UPS store who was a family friend, and had apparently just notarized it without actually watching Mark and Brooke sign in person, which is not supposed to happen, and is its own separate problem for that notary. The bank ended up freezing the loan and opening an internal review. Carol was understandably panicking, calling Mark almost daily, saying things like, "You're going to get me arrested," and "I did this for your sister," and "You're tearing this family apart over paperwork." Denny called once too, quieter, and just asked Mark to try to find a way to fix it without involving the police, because an actual criminal fraud charge could affect Carol's job. She worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company, and a fraud conviction would end that career completely. This is where things got complicated in a way I didn't expect, which I guess is twist number 5. Mark and Brooke had to decide, together, whether they wanted to pursue this as an actual legal fraud case against their own mother, or whether they wanted to find a private resolution. They went back and forth for almost 2 weeks. Brooke, surprisingly, was the one who was harder on Carol at first, saying she felt more betrayed because her name had been used to functionally hide a debt on paperwork tied to her own apartment application, something that could have actually cost her the apartment if the timing had been slightly different. In the end, they didn't press charges. What they did instead was go back to the bank with a request: dissolve the current loan entirely, have Carol and Denny refinance it in their names only, using Denny's pension as additional income verification, since he had enough now that his back surgery was behind him and he could go back to part-time work, and remove Mark and Brooke from any liability completely. It took about 6 weeks, but it went through. Alongside that, and this was actually Brooke's idea, they asked Carol and Denny to finally put something in writing about the cabin. Not a full transfer, since Carol and Denny still wanted to use it themselves while they're alive, but a simple document, drawn up by an actual estate attorney, stating that upon Carol and Denny's deaths, the cabin passes equally to Mark and Brooke, and that neither Carol nor Denny can take out any loan or lien against the property without written consent from both of them going forward while they're still living. Carol resisted that part hardest of anything, because I think putting it in writing felt to her like admitting she'd lost the authority she'd always assumed she had over that house and over her kids' futures in general. She signed it anyway, eventually, mostly because Denny told her, apparently for the first time in their marriage according to Mark, that he thought she was wrong and that the kids deserved it in writing after what had happened. Things are still tense. We go to the cabin less than we used to. Thanksgiving last year was quiet and a little stiff. Carol made a comment about how she hoped everyone was happy now that lawyers were involved, which Mark just let slide because he didn't want another fight in front of Brooke's kids. Brooke moved into her own apartment in the fall, the same one she'd originally applied for, and she's doing okay. She has a full-time job now at a dental supply company and picks up her kids from Carol's on weekends. She and Carol still talk, but Brooke told me privately that something shifted for her, that she doesn't take her mom's version of events at face value anymore the way she used to. Mark and I are fine. Honestly, this whole thing, as awful as it was, made us communicate better, because for the first time he actually made a decision about his family instead of just absorbing whatever Carol decided and hoping it would resolve itself. I don't think he'll ever be totally comfortable around his mom the same way again, and I feel a little guilty sometimes that it was me who noticed the whole thing at the bank in the first place, because part of me wonders if it would have all come out eventually anyway, or if Carol would have quietly paid it off and none of us would have ever known how close Mark's credit came to being wrecked over a debt he never agreed to. My own mom thinks I did the right thing pushing Mark to look into it instead of dropping it. My friend Priya thinks I should have stayed out of the sibling side of it entirely and let Mark and Brooke handle it without me in the room that first day at Carol's kitchen table. Mark says he's glad I came with him, because he doesn't think he would have had the nerve to actually go through the folder line by line without me standing there. I still think about that day at the bank sometimes. Pam just casually congratulating me on a refinance I knew nothing about. If she hadn't said anything, I genuinely don't know how long it would have taken for any of us to find out, or what kind of financial mess Mark and Brooke would have woken up to years down the line. Was I wrong to push this as hard as I did, even knowing it would strain Mark's relationship with his mom for a long time?